Good morning, afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for taking out time to attend today's webinar. My name is Noman Ishtiaq, and I work with Sustainable Finance Hub at the UNDP. And today we're fortunate to have been given this opportunity to discuss a very important issue, and that is the implication of climate, energy, and green policies on social aspects. What we hope to achieve from this discussion is better understanding, but at the same time, we also hope that this discussion will lead to design of improved climate change and energy policies that will be both fair and equitable. We also hope to learn from our panelists based on their experiences on these issues. Now, this webinar is supported by the Institute for Climate Economics, by International Institute for Sustainable Development, ODI, and the UNDP. This will be around 1.5 hours a session, and I will be the moderator. To start, I'll briefly explain the agenda of today's webinar. I'm going to be making an introductory remark shortly, but before that, just a little bit more about myself. As I said, I work with the UNDP, and we work on the issue of public finances for SDGs in the area where I work. We all know that COVID-19, the current war, and climate change have all led to profound increase in the challenges towards the implementation of the SDGs. We at the UNDP, we work with countries to better align public as well as private finance, and we provide a range of services to help countries align and raise finances for SDG acceleration. I will also talk a little bit about the climate change budget and coding and tagging initiatives. Just a brief background to give an update of where we stand. On the Q&A, can I request all the questions may be posted on the chat box, and by the end, towards the end of this session, we'll have about 20-25 minutes to discuss some of the key questions. Secondly, I will request our two presenters to make around 10 minutes of presentation each. First on inequality and poverty dashboard. This is going to be undertaken by Josham Roth, who's a policy analyst with IISD. And then I will request Celine to make a presentation on social impacts of French green budget, a study that has been undertaken by the I4CE. She's a research fellow in the Institute. Then we will request our panelists to not only provide their inputs on the presentation made, their observations, but we'll also put in front of them some of the key questions to answer. Firstly, for example, Jason Farr from Oxfam, will request him to provide us with his input on how to design just and fair energy transition and why is it needed. Then we will request Louisa, who is from CE40 Citizens Climate Leadership Group, to explain how cities can play a role in delivering an inclusive and just climate transition. Thirdly, we will request Michael to talk about energy pricing and how can energy pricing be developed in an equitable manner. Lastly, we will request our panelist Enrico to discuss what are the implications on labor of low carbon transition. And at the end, around 20-25 minutes, we'll take some key questions from our participants. So please bear with us, and please pose your questions on the chat box. Thank you. I'll make a very quick introductory remark. We all know that the measures to adapt and mitigate against climate change, a number of countries are putting in a considerable amount of public funds towards adaptation and mitigation. And hence, they are impacting many of the social issues more precisely on poverty and inequality. Now, these impacts can be both positive as well as negative. I'll give you an example of carbon taxes, which can increase income inequality. But on the other side, there can be positive impact. For example, investments related to public transportation and enhancing mobility for less connected population. On the other hand, similarly, social policy measures can also have impact on climate change. For example, as the energy prices are going up, governments are inclined towards providing energy subsidies towards for the poor households, and often, unwillingly, these incentives lead to increase in consumption of fossil fuels and fossil energies. So with this background, the purpose of our today's webinar is to examine, one, the complex relationship between social impacts of climate and energy policies, and we hope that it would lead to considering the importance of integrating climate and social perspectives to increase sustainability. And in today's discussion, we will look at the social impacts that are expected from climate and energy policies. We'll also be looking at how to design climate and energy policies to alleviate potential detrimental social impacts. We will also hear from our colleagues on energy policy tracker, and from our colleague on French green budget and how that has been linked to the methodology developed for social implications. And at the end, we'll also look at the challenges in evaluation of social impacts. Very briefly on climate change, budget coding and tagging. At the UNDP, we have actually pioneered some of the reforms related to public finance and climate change. On the climate change, we have looked at and helped countries develop climate public expenditure and institutional reviews, through which we look at not only the efficiency, but also the element of equity. Now, these institutional reviews and public expenditure reviews haven't actually looked at the social implication. And I think that's one of the key reasons that this subject of how the interaction and implications can be seen, especially from the government's budget perspective, would be very interesting to note. We also have been providing support in developing climate change financing frameworks, which help develop understanding of how the financing of climate change adaptation and mitigation activities will be undertaken, not only from the public, but also from the private sector perspective. For climate budget coding and tagging, I think we've been supporting this for the past 7 or 8 years. As you know, climate change is a cross-cutting theme. I once sat down to count the number of SDGs where climate change or green initiatives are mentioned, and I came up with around 12 SDGs out of about 17. The climate change related coding and tagging is an exercise through which we map the public expenditure, the public budgets, both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side as well. Here we can we have been working with around 10-12 countries in Asia Pacific region, but we've been also informed that these initiatives have now been accelerated around 60 countries around the world. And that exercise has helped not only in shaping better policies, but also in nationally determined contributions. As part of the budget coding and tagging, the last point that I want to make is that various taxonomies have been proposed. There is no standard methodology as yet. For example, in certain countries, the budget coding and tagging exercise is actually closely monitored by the climate policies and that have been mapped with their national policies. But equally important are 6 objectives by OECD through which tagging can be undertaken. French budget tagging example is the example through which this has been done. International Capital Markets Association has developed some sort of taxonomy for green bonds, and OECD DAC remarks have also been made to look at more closely in these areas. So I'm going to stop here and request our presenters from IISD and I4CE to make a presentation. First, I'll request Josh Roth to make a presentation on inequality and poverty dashboard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noman. I'm just going to share my screen.
Please do.
Yeah, there we go. So thank you very much for the introduction, Noman, and it's a pleasure being here with you all today. So as Noman's saying, I'm a policy analyst working with the IISD, and today I'll be presenting the findings from our latest research, which assesses the impacts of COVID-19 responses on the energy transition, inequality, and poverty. So there's really, in our view, 3 key reasons why governments should care about the social impacts of energy policies, and specifically not neglect inequality reduction. So the first argument is there's an equity argument. Data from the World Inequality Database shows that the poorest 50% of the world's population contribute only to 12% of global emissions. But in contrast, the richest 10% contribute nearly half of these emissions. So clearly, lower income groups should not bear the brunt of climate inaction. So for these reasons, policymakers should ensure, first of all, that lower income groups do not face higher energy costs linked to the energy transition, that there is equal access to environmental goods and services, but also that there aren't excessive job losses in fossil fuel producing regions. And the second key argument is that not taking into account the social impacts, and specifically inequality, can threaten public acceptance in the energy transition. So we've seen this, of course, with the Yellow Vest movement in France, also the fuel price protest in Ecuador, and there are many other examples. And finally, research shows that higher inequality is detrimental to socioeconomic development. So for all these reasons, it's particularly important to assess the social impact of energy policies and also not neglect inequality impacts. So in terms of the Inequality and Poverty Dashboard, so this is a project jointly developed by ODI and IISD. The way it works is that we used the Energy Policy Tracker, a tool launched in July 2020, which tracks COVID-19 response policies related to energy production and consumption. And so we look at, within this tool, at the likely poverty and inequality impacts of more than 1,000 energy policies in 30 countries between January 2020 and November 2021. And in order to do this, what we do is that we group similar energy policies into what we call policy categories. So essentially what policy categories are is, as I said, they group similar types of energy policies together for each of the sectors covered in the EPT. So for buildings, mobility, power, and resource extraction, and then also group these policy categories by energy type. So whether it's for clean energy, fossil fuels. And so as some examples of policy categories, for example, would be a government support for EV charging infrastructure, or the bailout of airlines, or government support for energy efficiency and retrofits and social housing. So within each of these policy categories, there's multiple types of policies that governments can put in place that would fall in each of these categories. So you can see from the picture on the right here how the dashboard looks, and the link also to the dashboard at the bottom of the table. So essentially what it does, and this is a summary assessment, is that it provides a sense of the direction of likely poverty and inequality impacts for different types of policy categories. And it also shows the types of indicators and complementary social policies that can affect the scale and magnitude of these poverty and inequality impacts for different types of energy policies. And finally, for each policy category, it counts all the energy policies listed in the Energy Policy Tracker that fall into each policy category. So it gives a better overview of how many policies might potentially have these poverty and inequality impacts. That being said, I think this is a first tool which is provides a very helpful way to understand how different types of energy policies can affect poverty and inequality. But there are also some aspects that are beyond the scope of the dashboard. For example, it does not provide a country-specific assessment, so it was beyond the scope of this first research project to compare how different countries are faring in terms of poverty and inequality with regards to different types of energy policies. And also, it does not provide a detailed assessment of how a specific type of energy policy, for example, that's implemented in a given country or context can affect poverty and inequality. So it's more an overview of the likely poverty and inequality impacts that could emerge from certain types of energy policies. So giving you a little bit more detail on the methodology behind the dashboard. So how does it work? So first of all, what we did is that we came up with a conceptual framework here that you can see on the right. And also, this conceptual framework was used to develop an in-depth literature review. And specifically, what we did is for all the policy categories that we listed, there were about 32, which again account for more than 1,000 energy policies. We examined how these policy categories would affect. We looked specifically at income inequality, so the difference between higher and lower income groups, and then monetary, but also multidimensional poverty. This is more of a qualitative assessment. So this means we didn't use specific quantitative metrics to assess this, but we used our conceptual framework to guide our literature review to assess the likely impacts that could emerge. So what we did, for example, is to look at impacts on households and firms in terms of how energy policies might lead to, first of all, changes to wages and employment. How could it lead to changes in energy or commodity prices? Whether certain energy policies may have spatial impacts, so whether there would be likely localized job gains or losses. And finally, when it was feasible, we assessed as well some of the temporal impacts that could emerge. So for example, certain energy policies might reduce energy costs, but this won't emerge until the medium and long run. So the first key finding from the dashboard, which I think is an interesting finding, is that energy policies that we analyzed from the EPT, we found that they're more likely to decrease poverty than inequality. In fact, we found 60% of the policies we analyzed were more likely to decrease poverty, in contrast to only 11% that are likely to decrease inequality. So this potentially may reflect, since we're talking about COVID-19 response policies for the majority of them, that governments focused more on immediate relief to households and industries during the pandemic, with less of a focus on inequality reduction. Now, that being said, it's important to caveat some of our findings as well. As I mentioned, we were not able to provide country-specific assessments or compare countries between each other. And of course, these findings will vary largely depending on the national context. So an example would be to look at the average household energy spending in the country. What is the car ownership rate, or the formality of the job market? So for example, we know that carbon pricing tends to be more progressive in lower income countries, where higher income groups have a higher energy expenditure, but that may not be the case in higher income countries. And also, what I think was a relevant point from our dashboard is that the same energy policy can impact poverty and inequality in different directions. So for retrofits in private housing or subsidies to electric vehicles, high income groups are more likely to capture the benefits from these subsidy schemes initially due to better access to information, but also the ability to benefit more from these schemes. But at the same time, these policies, due to the labor intensiveness, particularly for retrofits, will likely reduce poverty. So there can be differentiated poverty and inequality impacts in this way. And another important finding is that our analysis goes against the preconceived idea that clean energy policies will always have positive social outcomes and that fossil fuel policies will always have negative social outcomes. So you can see the two pie charts on the right. We find that 61% of the policies likely to increase inequality are clean energy policies, for example, but 57% of policies likely to decrease poverty are also clean energy policies. So there's no clear there's no clear relationship between social and environmental impacts, if I can put it that way. That being said, what we also show is that the time scale over which these impacts are measured is particularly important. So if we look at clean energy policies, it is true that there can be some short-term costs for certain types of clean energy policies, but that these costs are likely to be significantly, if not completely reduced for all income groups over the medium and long run, as the demand for these clean energy products and services increases and prices decrease, both for low and high income groups. But in contrast, we see that fossil fuel policies may have some short-term benefits, but present significant climate and social risks, both in the medium and long run. And I'll explain this a little bit more in a second. So what we also do is group policies, and we find that there are two categories of policies that are interesting. Specifically, we call them win-win and lose-lose policies. So by win-win policies, what we mean is that there's a number of policies listed that have positive impacts on poverty, inequality, and climates. But these policies only account for 13% of the policies we could find in the energy policy tracker. And this includes, for example, retrofits in social housing. So clearly retrofits will create jobs, so there can be poverty reduction that way. But if there is retrofits in social housing, there is targeting as well. So you have reduced energy costs specifically for lower income households. And so in that way, these policies have both social and climate benefits. But we see that there's a very limited number of policies in the EPT that fall into this category. So there's really an opportunity to increase these types of policy implementation. And then we have also what we call lose-lose policies. So based on our analysis, these are policies that mostly support fossil fuel production. Again, there's some nuance here. For example, if you looked at environmental rehabilitation of mining sites or the cleanup of orphan and active wells, there can be some poverty reducing impacts and more positive impacts on the climate. But for the majority of what the fossil fuel production policies that we've seen, despite some short-term benefits in terms of increased energy supply and energy security, we find also many medium and long-run costs, both social and climate costs. So this again is linked to air pollution, which is particularly detrimental to lower-income groups, job gains, which are often spatially uneven, and in countries where support to fossil fuel production is really high, this can potentially hamper economic diversification efforts. Now, I've really talked about some of our high-level findings, but it's particularly key to keep in mind as well that the policy design, the way energy policies are designed, the type of complementary social policies that are put in place can completely offset negative social outcomes. So I'll give 3 examples, and you can see on the right different types of examples that we listed from our analysis. The recycling of revenues, that would be a first one. So if we take carbon pricing, for example, we know that if there's no recycling of revenues, it can be detrimental for energy consumers, for lower income groups, but also it can increase inequality potentially in certain countries. And there can be repercussions in terms of higher food prices, higher transport costs, and a number of impacts. That being said, if revenues are recycled, and there's a number of ways to do this, and there's no blueprint, it can be context specific. For example, having cash transfers to households or using revenues to retrain workers, this can completely offset negative social impacts. And there's a number of research that shows this. And the second point is that including local communities in decision-making processes is particularly important. First of all, if we think of clean energy projects, for example, this can reduce the information gap, knowledge about how these projects are being implemented, can increase a sense of community ownership, and in the end, can ensure that certain groups are not excluded from how these projects are conducted. And finally, another potentially, I think, very important complementary policy is the targeting. So I mentioned targeting, for example, of cash transfers to certain types of households for carbon pricing, but there could also be targeted retraining. If you think of building retrofits, that of course there can be a job creating impact, but it could the impact could be even higher for poverty reduction, equality reduction, if there are trainings tailored to workers, for example, with lower skills. So let me just wrap up in terms of 4 key takeaways and recommendations. So the first one, which I've tried to highlight, is really ending support to policies with both detrimental social and climate impacts. While this isn't the case for every single one of them, we found that many fossil fuel production policies fall in this category. With the latest IPCC report, we know the clock is ticking, and quite frankly, there is no, at least in the medium long run, rationale for continuing these policies. The second point is the scale of support for win-win policies. So again, policies that are likely to reduce emissions while decreasing inequality and poverty. So support for retrofits in social housing is an example, but we see that there's still an untapped potential here to increase funding for these types of policies, and there were a limited number that we could find in the EPT. And then the third point is that it's really key for governments to not only focus on poverty reduction, but also inequality reduction, and also consider the long-term impacts of energy policies. So in the context of the energy price crisis, for example, it would be a better strategy to support households through investments in energy efficiency rather than reducing fossil fuel prices, which more often than not can be non-time bound or targeted. And therefore, the poverty or inequality reducing impacts is much more limited. And finally, the last point I like to mention is that there's no reason for delaying the energy transition. It is true that some clean energy policies can have detrimental social impacts, but we've seen how policy design and the implementation of complementary social policies can really completely mitigate negative social impacts when I mentioned carbon pricing, for example. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. And you can see here links to the Inequality and Poverty dashboard and also to our research, which summarizes our findings. And we can share this in the chat as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh. And can I now request Aline to make the presentation on the French green budget and the methodology used to assess the impacts on social matters? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Norman, for this introduction, and to all of you for being here today. So my name is Solène Métayer. I am a research fellow at I4CE, and today I'm going to present you a framework that we developed that aims to take into account climate and social issues jointly in budget making processes. So this framework results from 1 year of research, and we applied this framework to the French Green Budget Assessment for 2022. And I'll present as well a preliminary result of this case study. So in the past few years, we see a heightened awareness of the need to tackle climate and social issues together. So of course, there's been several protest movements across the globe, in particular in France with the Yellow Vest movement, for instance. And and these movements, well, they show how climate policies can have negative social impacts. On the other hand, we see also the emergence of several concepts and social movements at the crossroads of the two climate and social issues. For example, the concept of a just transition or the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations. And so these types of movements show that there are a lot of opposite effects between climate and social policies, but there are also some opportunities for co-benefits. And this is what you can see here on the graph on the right. And this is what we should aim to have policies that can have both positive climate impacts and also positive social impacts. So to reach this double dividend quadrant. And well, overall, we can say there is, well, climate and social concerns from one single issue, which is low carbon development. So to take into account both climate and social issues, we decided to focus on the state budget for several reasons. So first, the state budget amounts to between a fourth to half of a country's GDP. So the state budget is one of the driving forces behind public action, and in particular, climate public action, or as well inaction. And so in the framework we developed, we look at all types of budgetary measure, so budgetary expenditure, but also taxes and tax expenditure. Another element is that climate and social issues are today addressed in silos in budget making processes, meaning that on one hand, we have climate budget decision makers who often don't consider social issues. And on the other hand, social policy makers or members of parliaments or NGOs working on social issues who don't always consider climate impacts of social policies or lack resources to assess climate policies' social side effects. And so overall, this results in a lack of a comprehensive overview of the cross-cutting effects of climate and social policies, which is necessary to make informed budgetary decisions and respond to these two societal challenges. And so this calls for an adaptation of existing climate tools, such as climate budget tagging, in order to integrate social issues. So here on the map, you can see that, well, there is a rise of climate budget assessments worldwide, as was Norman mentioning at the beginning of his introduction speech. And so more than 50 countries worldwide have carried out at least one climate budget assessment. And so climate budget assessment allowed to increase transparency about climate mitigation and adaptation impacts of public budgets. And it can provide an analytical framework in order to, for the cross-analysis of both climate and social impacts of public budgets. And so this is what we have been doing and trying to achieve with the framework we developed. So for this framework, we really build on climate budget tagging meaning that we start with climate-related budget measures. And to these measures, we apply a framework in order to select budgetary measures that have both climate and social impacts. The objective of this is to highlight the overall climate and social co-impact of a public budget. And then in a second stage, we select the most relevant measures, so the budgetary measures that have the most significant climate and social impacts, so about 10 to 15 of these measures. And we'll see, I will come back to this later, but we'll see how to analyze more in detail these measures. And so this framework that we developed can be applied to any climate budget taking assessment that takes into consideration both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Now, so I've been talking for a few minutes about social impacts, and some of you might be wondering to what exactly I am referring to, and in particular, how our population impacted by climate-related budgetary measures. And so the population can be impacted on several, and well, more specifically 5 social dimensions, which are, for instance, income inequality, employment, health. And in parallel to these social dimensions, there are different individual or group factors, characteristics, that can influence how and who is actually impacted by climate-related budgetary measures. So for instance, age, gender, or the job sector can influence who is actually impacted by climate-related budgetary measures. And so taking into account all these social dimensions and intensification factors and climate budgeting, as I was talking about before, we developed a framework or a tool that allows to identify budgetary measures with both climate and social impacts. So this framework includes about 100 types of budgetary measures that have climate impacts and that can also have social impacts. So these 100 measures rely on a literature review, and all the social impacts identified were taken and identified from the literature. And what we do here is that, well, for each of these budgetary measures that have climate impact as well tagged in the climate budget assessments, we try to analyze whether these measures also have social impacts, if so, on which social dimensions, and how do intensification factors can influence those impacts. So this is what you can see here with the example of the measure development of renewable energy projects. And so the last lines of this graph, of this figure, you can see whether or not development of renewable energy project has impacts on the social indicators listed here. One important, well, 2 important comments here. First, we only look at climate-related measures, and so the social impacts of climate-related measures. We don't consider the whole budget. And second, we look at both positive and negative social impacts. Although, in some cases, it is not possible to precisely identify whether the impacts are positive or negative. And in some cases, well, depending on the context or on national specificities, the impacts can differ. And so we applied this framework to the French Green Budget for 2022. And this is the results that we obtained. So, well, most climate-related budgetary measures also have social impacts. Here you can see that 80% of climate-related budgetary expenditure have social impacts, and this figure raises to 100% for taxes and tax expenditure. With this framework, we can also assess well, the impact of budgetary measures on each social dimensions. And so this is what you can see on the right side of this slide. And in particular, the social dimensions, health and poverty and income, are the ones that are the most impacted. So this was the first stage of the framework that I presented just before. And now the second stage, as I was mentioning, is to bring out most relevant measures, or as we can call them, social climate hotspots. In order to do this, we take into consideration different selection criteria, which are the amount of a measure, the scale of climate impacts, and the scale of social impacts. And applying this, well, this selection criteria to the French budget measures that have both climate and social impacts, we get 14 measures that in total amount to 60 billion euros. And so these are the 14 measures of the French 2022 green budget. And so, yeah, these 14 measures alone amount to 60 billion euros, which represents about 2/3 of all budgetary measures that have both climate and social impacts. So at the top, you have budgetary expenditure, then you have some tax expenditure, and the three last lines are taxes. One thing to note about these 14 hotspots is that overall they can be clustered into only 4 sectors. So there are some measures that relate to renovation of buildings, some measures relating to transport, agriculture and forest, and also energy measures. Once we have those 14 hotspots, as I was saying before, our objective is to analyze them more in depth and to, well, try to determine ways to reform these social climate hotspots. And in order to do this, we take into consideration different criteria. First, the rationale for reform. So what is the current issue, whether environmental, climate or social issue of the budget measure? And what are we trying to achieve with the reform? Then the proposed reform, which can be either another design option or a complementary design. We also look at climate and social trade-offs of the proposed reform. We include cost benefits for the government. We also look at drivers or barriers to public acceptability of the measures. And finally, we also try to assess the complementarity between different proposed reforms. And so we applied this framework to the 14 hotspots of the French green budget. And here is simply an example for one of the tax exemptions, which was reduced diesel tax for freight trucks. And so, as you can see here, well, a proposition of reform for this measure could be to simply remove the reduced rate. The goal of removing the reduced rates are numerous. First, to reduce fossil fuel consumption, to encourage low carbon alternatives, to foster modal shift, and to limit air pollution. So these are the objectives of the reform, but you see that there can be some trade-offs and, well, in particular, social side effects for the freight sector, in particular on impact on revenue and the competitiveness of the sector. Regarding the government, well, there are benefits to removing the reduced rate because it reduces tax expenditure, of course. But then if we look at public acceptability, there is probably going to be a strong opposition from drivers and the, well, professionals of the sectors. So in order to address this acceptability issue, which is in a way the most important of the negative impacts of this proposed reform, we can think about complementary measures that could mitigate this strong opposition. So for instance, increased subsidies for the rail and waterway freight or development of freight infrastructure. And so maybe two key comments to conclude here. It is that first, well, it is not always necessary to choose between climate and social co-benefits. And looking for complementarity and interconnection between hotspots is very important because, well, the hotspots are highly interrelated and it can either reinforce or mitigate some positive and negative impacts. And for these reasons, it is very important to look at, well, these measures and well, more generally, the overall budget in a holistic way. And this is it. Just one more comment. So this methodology will be published online. And well, the objective is for any country with a green budget assessment to apply this methodology to its own green budget in order to highlight its own social impacts of its budget climate-related measures. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celine. I was just about to ask you the question about publication of the methodology, but thank you very much. If the methodology in detail is going to be published, I think it will allow not only the countries but also development partners to use this methodology to assess the impact and maybe replicate it in different parts of the world. So we'll move on to the next session, whereby we are now going to request panelists to not only reflect their views on these two presentations very briefly, but also we have certain questions for them. And I'll request Jason from Oxfam to start. First, very briefly, your input on these two presentations. And then we have a question for you. Why is a just and fair energy transition needed, in your opinion? And how will it help address inequality? Jason, over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Noman, and thanks, Celine and Joshim, for the excellent presentations. My name is Jason Farr. I'm a policy advocacy and program advisor for Oxfam based in Washington, D.C. And yeah, thanks to IISD and I4CE and ODI for organizing this panel and for others involved in putting this on. It's really interesting and important piece of work. Yeah, the presentations, I was quite struck by, I was pleased to hear Celine's point about the finding that most of the climate policies, climate-related budget expenditures had positive social impacts. I think the methodology is really interesting, and I would like to see that applied elsewhere, and I do look forward to reviewing that. I was also quite struck by some of the points from Joshim's report, including the point that clean policies are not systematically progressive and fossil fuel policies are not always regressive. The analysis found that a greater share of clean energy policies were likely to increase inequality than fossil fuel policies, though a greater share of clean energy policies were likely to reduce poverty. I think this highlights why it's so important to assess the anticipated social impacts of these policies to avoid potentially regressive effects. This was also well demonstrated by the fact that only 13% of those policies reviewed were classified as win-win, with both positive and social and environmental impacts. Although on the bright side, it was good to see that more than 60% of the policies seemed like they could reduce poverty based on this analysis. Also appreciated the point of involving the importance of involving communities in policy design, advocating for civil society organizations and communities to be involved in policy decision making is something that's really important to Oxfam's work. So yeah, thanks for the presentations, really excellent work, and I encourage others to read the reports if you haven't yet, and to look further into this climate budget tagging methodology. So to the questions posed for me specifically, I'd like to take a step back and discuss inequality in the energy transition sort of more broadly in the global context. As many of you likely know, the issue of inequality is central to our work at Oxfam. Earlier this year, we released a report in advance of the World Economic Forum at Davos, looking at the relationship between inequality and the impacts of the pandemic. Our report, titled "Inequality Kills," had some quite disturbing findings about this relationship. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the wealth of the world's 10 richest men doubled, while incomes of 99% of humanity are worse off. The same report found that inequality contributes to a death of at least one person every 4 seconds. And the climate crisis has been both a driver of this inequality and has in ways resulted from it. Our work has also estimated that the richest 20 billionaires on average are responsible for emitting 8,000 times more carbon than the billion poorest people. And the emissions of the richest 10% are the same as the rest of the world combined. So inequality has driven the climate crisis, while the poor face its worst impacts, despite the fact that the wealthy have emitted most. This is why it's so important that policymakers heed the advice found in the presentations we've heard today and make sure energy policies not only aim to reduce emissions and protect the environment, but that they also reduce rather than exacerbate existing inequality and poverty as well. For energy and climate policies to advance an energy transition that is truly just on a global scale, I think it's important that the energy transition goes beyond transitioning existing fossil fuel-based systems to clean energy. We must also make the investments needed to provide universal access to energy for those who don't yet have it, and to end energy poverty globally. Today, just under 800 million people remain without access to electricity, In sub-Saharan Africa alone, more than 600 million people remain without access, and many people still rely on firewood to cook, which contributes to poor health outcomes as well. And then when it comes to reliable access to electricity, estimates are in the billions of the numbers of people who don't have access to reliable electricity. So massive investments are needed to provide universal access to reliable electricity, not just for homes, but to power growing economies. And while energy access is not a silver bullet to development, it is a necessary component. Further, while the need for a rapid transition to clean energy around the globe and a build out of clean energy based systems in countries of with high levels of energy poverty is incredibly important, and it is a must. It's something that we must do to meet our climate goals. We also know that clean energy is not devoid of some of the same flaws of the current fossil fuel based system. Many of the risks are quite similar because of the required growth in manufacturing of wind, solar, and battery technologies. For example, we're poised to see continued growth in demand for minerals needed to manufacture these technologies, also referred to as transition minerals. Poor mining practices can lead to human rights violations, environmental damage, and the displacement of communities without free, prior, and informed consent. And you also have mega renewable projects that can present similar challenges given land requirements and potential for community opposition. So these issues are an all too common feature of the extractive fossil fuel-based economy and cannot be allowed to be perpetuated if the energy transition is to be truly just. I should say that we at Oxfam are undergoing our own journey to develop a shared understanding of what just energy transition means to us and what exactly is required to get there. But I'd like to share a few ideas that have surfaced so far. A just energy transition requires that affected communities have a say in decisions that affect them. This is a point that came up in the report in the presentation today as well. And this is not only just, but it can also contribute to the success of an energy policy or project. It also requires a fair distribution of the responsibilities, costs, and benefits of climate and energy action across society, including ensuring that those with the biggest responsibilities and capabilities make the biggest and fastest cuts in emissions. Those with the greatest responsibility bear the greatest costs and do not push those costs onto others, and that the benefits are shared fairly. It also requires that the concerns of and injustices experienced by social groups affected by climate policies and programs are recognized and addressed. And it requires that the negatively impacted people are fairly compensated. So by doing this and advancing and growing this clean energy, renewable energy-based economy, we do think that we can reduce inequality while also meeting our climate targets, and that really should be the goal. That should be what we aim for. We shouldn't allow the energy transition to be unjust and further contribute to these issues. So, with that, I'd like to say thanks again for this opportunity and for the great work of our organizers and the presenters. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jason. Grateful for this. We'll move on to Louisa from C40 Cities. Now, cities being engine of growth are also playing an important role in delivering an inclusive and just climate transition. Can we request Louisa to, enlighten us what is going to be needed to support them in this transition? Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. And thank you also to Solène and Joaquin for their fantastic presentations, and to Jason for setting the scene on a just and energy transition for us. Just to kind of reflect a little bit on what's already been presented, as I was listening to Joaquin and Solène, I was particularly interested in thinking, or inviting us to think about the users of these tools and how these tools might be incredibly useful for cities in their decision-making processes too. For example, my understanding of what has been discussed already today and the relevant implications for designing and delivering fair and equitable climate and energy policies is very much informed by perspectives from technical staff that work across multiple city government, climate and social departments in various regions in the world. And when thinking about energy policies and their impact on poverty and inequality, we have to consider that leading cities are actually tackling energy poverty through many different non-energy and sometimes less traditional climate sectors too. For example, Seattle is working on tackling energy poverty through their housing policies, Barcelona through their social care policies and programs, etc. So I wonder, and this is a sort of a question as well, I wonder how might these tools be adapted to city level decision making, first of all, and consider policies beyond the energy sector that will help tackle energy poverty, really embracing the nature of energy poverty and inequality, which is itself so multidimensional. Considering particularly that in these times of overlapping crises that have already been discussed, city staff are expected to design policies and deliver programs and provide effective and accessible services whilst managing increasingly limited budgets and capacity and more urgency to act quickly and at scale, and sometimes with less visibility to take action due to the lack of data and the rapidly changing dynamics that characterize cities. So supporting cities to seize these challenges and convert them into opportunities by identifying cross-programmatic synergies, like Solène was discussing, is fundamental because it can really help leverage budgets and support intersectional program design and delivery in the immediate and longer term. So when we talk about climate, energy, and social justice and the role that cities play, we should really start from the understanding that C40 city leaders recognize that the energy crisis is not just about availability and cost. It puts all testing city and community capacities to sustain quality of life and their livelihoods, and mayors' capacities to meet commitments made to ensure social and environmental justice. So this is why C40 mayors and their cities are working to tackle this headfirst and drive what they call and what we call the delivery of a just energy transition, hand in hand with worker unions, businesses, and civil society to deliver transformative, urgent actions that support communities today and in the future. And an example of this, of city-based action based on this understanding, is mayors' efforts to convene a joint statement with union leaders at COP26 on just transition and the energy crisis, a statement that they are now delivering on through the convening of a mayoral energy poverty roundtable co-hosted between Mayor Sadiq Khan and Mayor Ada Colau of Barcelona and the International Trade Union Confederation earlier this month. And these actions are really sending strong messages to regional and national governments on the important role that cities are playing and can play going forward as well. So C40 supports cities in these convening and advocacy efforts, as well as providing direct technical assistance, for example, through our climate budgeting pilots, which is what I'd really like to dive deep into today. So through this pilot, we're working with cities to resystematize their governance decision-making processes. So climate budgeting is a whole of government approach. So for us, it's not solely about climate sectors. It's acting as a governance system that drives effective implementation of short-term climate actions to deliver medium and long-term emission reduction targets. So this means that climate becomes a core consideration in the whole organization, transitioning priorities and resources towards delivering targets. To do so, measures are proposed, implemented, monitored, and this is all in line with the budget cycle and is in sync with political and emergency moments of transition happening in the city. And the climate budget helps identify the responsible units for the implementation, meaning that there is assigned responsibility to see the actions through and report on them, thus providing an accountability mechanism. And this approach also systematizes and secures fast-paced delivery of actions today and in future by breaking down traditional silos in a city government and administration going forward. The city of Oslo is the first in the world to implement a climate budgeting approach in this way. And it's leading the pilots alongside 12 other pioneering cities that are really demonstrating leadership in this space by taking their own initial steps to resystematize their governance mechanisms as well. But at C40, we also see a significant opportunity to combine climate budgeting with embedded equity and inclusion throughout decision-making processes and vice versa. So we see climate budgets and equity budgets being used individually by cities around the world. For example, Reykjavik uses gender budgeting. Philadelphia uses equity budgeting with a focus on racial justice. Toronto looks at environmental justice and reconciliation. And then we have our climate budgeting pilot cities as well. But the shift towards joining these two is really where I see that cities can play a fundamental role in driving the design of effective delivery of an inclusive and just climate transition. And this is a really important opportunity because it's new and shiny, but very important as well, which it means that our politicians are increasingly driven by this dual benefits because it's aligned with their priorities to deliver dual targets at the intersection between climate, energy, and social justice. And it's an opportunity to encompass the bigger picture in decision-making as well. So it secures political commitments and greater ambition. It secures institutional governance support and additional resources, and sometimes even greater delegated power from their regional and national governments to local governments to act. And it's also a really important space for innovation because it helps break silos within city government decision-making, and it opens up spaces for creative out-of-the-box thinking. It really helps city teams develop a common language and institutional capacity to not only recognize what equity and inclusion success looks like within their sectors, but also to know when it doesn't exist, or worse, when a climate action is actually causing injustice. And lastly, it can help secure engagement and collaboration with external stakeholders on immediate actions to deliver dual targets simultaneously. So going forward, we hope to upscale this pilot with the cities beyond the 13 cities and continue mainstreaming equity considerations into their climate budgets. And we're really exploring this with the cities who are demanding this support from us. They want to act as a testing bed and drive our learning and help us understand where further support is needed. So that leads me to answering as well the final question, which is, within this space of innovation and governance and great city ambition to drive the systemic changes necessary, what is needed? What are the resources and the thinking that is needed to help build this, this process? First of all, capacity to collect and analyze disaggregated data, particularly related to city level disaggregated data on energy accessibility, energy poverty, but also the intersection between these and health sectors, for example, or other non-environmental sectors. The access and availability of this data, not only to the data itself, but also to frameworks and tools to apply the data and use it to make decisions. As equity can not always be measured, as already mentioned today, it's also the need for resources that can help more qualitative decision-making, like those that we've seen today at the city level, will also be very useful. And it's important to note that different cities prioritize different equity challenges. So resources that are adaptable to different equity considerations are very useful. Finally, some cities have shared that their teams have varying levels of understanding about equity and inclusion concepts and the technical knowledge that it takes to actually apply those within their sectors, as well as in dialogue with external stakeholders. And this can generate shyness or reluctance to engage in conversations about the topic and collaborate on solutions and work through tensions in dialogue. So there is also, like we're doing today, a continued need to talk about equity and inclusion within these multiple sectors and around like mainstreaming climate justice as a whole. So to conclude, mayors and city leaders, they have the capacity to act quickly and decisively, especially when decision-making power is delegated to them from regional and national governments. And when they recognize there's urgency, they work together, not only within their teams and with stakeholders, but also through city networks like C40 to share solutions and inspire each other to take bold action. And they're capable of achieving a great deal. So climate budgeting and the inclusion of equity considerations within this, if it's available and accessible to cities, is a mechanism that can ensure that whenever mayors and their teams are taking urgent action, this is done hand in hand with delivering climate justice. I hope that sort of answered your question.
Yes.
Thank you for listening.
Well, Louisa, thank you very much. Climate change budgeting is a subject in which the UNDP is exclusively working with around 15, 16 countries in Asia Pacific region and about 6 or 7 countries in Africa. And we've developed tools and methodologies how to help not only the national government, but also subnational governments and municipalities and cities, and how to integrate the SDGs and climate change into the budget cycle and into the budget allocation decision-making. Maybe those experiences can also help our participants today. Moving on, Michael, Jacob, can I request you to talk a little bit about energy pricing? I mean, this is an important subject. Energy prices are now increasing manifold, and there is now a desire to, in certain countries, to subsidize energy pricing. In certain cases, maybe allow certain exemptions and concessions on the taxation side. So how, in your opinion, energy pricing can be developed in an equitable way? Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. And thanks a lot for all these great presentations. And I very much appreciate the points raised by the panelists.
Michael, we can't hear you very clearly. Is it possible that you can speak a little bit louder? Thank you.
Okay, so I have to shout a little bit.
Okay. This is better. Thank you.
So, as you said, high energy prices are a huge concern at the moment, especially for low-income households, because we know that low-income households tend to spend a higher share of their income on energy. So there are many people who might face troubles paying their heating bills to actually maintain their mobility in view of rising gasoline, diesel prices. And recently we've conducted a study where we looked on the European level where the most vulnerable households are located. So taking a measure of, maybe I can put up my microphone a bit. I just scream a little bit, sorry.
Very clear.
Of high energy costs and low income, we find that in the EU, we have about 4.5 million people in the lowest 2 income deciles, or about 6 million people in the lowest 3 income deciles, who spend a way above average share of their income on energy. So this would be the people we deem to be at risk of energy poverty. And these people are mostly located in the Eastern European member states. So basically all of them are based in Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Poland. So high energy prices cannot be only a problem within a country, but also could create significant tensions within the European Union. If there's an impression that the burden of higher energy costs is not shared equally among EU citizens. So many countries have actually implemented measures to shield these consumers from high energy prices. So for instance, there have been either changes to taxes. So the German government has announced that they will lower the tax on transport fuels to the minimum that is prescribed in the European the Energy Tax Directive, which of course would shield people from higher energy prices, but it has also very undesirable effects. So first, of course, is the environmental incentive, because you want actually people to respond to a pricing signal to use less energy, to shift to cleaner forms of consumption, to save energy, and so on. And on the other hand, it's also social inequity, because even though poor people spend a higher share of their income on energy, richer people, of course, spend more on absolute terms. So we've done some back of the envelope calculations, and it's very clear to see that capping fossil fuel prices is a very badly targeted policy. It's not a proper policy, because actually, if you want to confer €1 to the lowest 10% of the population, overall on the budget, you need to spend about €20. So if you want to help poor people, it's better to give them money or to give them something else and not cap fossil fuel prices. So the discussion now, at least the way I'm following it, is very much about financial compensation. So there are actually two approaches. One is like a very targeted approach to say, okay, we only want to focus on the energy poor households. This has the advantage that we achieve quite a lot with relatively new funds. The problem there is actually that you might leave someone behind who would actually be entitled to receive some compensation, because it's always hard to target these funds. So either because you cannot identify the people, you cannot really find a way to give the transfer. So for instance, of course, you could send a check, but sometimes this is not so easily actually to put in practice, and governments are resorting to different approaches to do that. For instance, by tax reductions, but people who don't pay taxes, of course, don't actually benefit from tax reductions, and so on. And on the other hand, if you just actually have an equal per capita handout, you would actually help everyone, but you would actually give a lot of money to people who are not really in need. So why do people who earn millions per year need actually a transfer for higher energy prices? And I think this is the trade-off the policymakers face in terms of financial compensation, that you need to somehow make up your mind what is actually possible given your institutional administrative framework, and how do you assess the trade-offs between spending too much money to compensate people who don't really need it, and on the other hand, preventing that people are being left behind. And things that have just been mentioned, and I think this is just actually coming up in discussion, is actually what might be the most preferable option to help people to adapt to higher prices, is not to give them money, but to actually create the conditions such that they can adapt more easily. For instance, when we're talking about transport, of course, expanding public transport is a good option. We're talking about heating, helping people to install heat pumps, to take care of insulation and so on, might be much more promising options than just monetary payoffs. And here, I think it's also important to take into account that it's probably not just the finance, it's not just giving people financial support to do that, but also think about what are the main barriers for people to make these switches. So for instance, you might think of what kind of situations people are living in, to really identify where energy poor households live, like it's rural, urban population, demographics, family size, and so on, and to see what kind of support they would need. So for instance, when we're talking about investments, often people do not take investments that pay off themselves because they don't have the initial capital. So for instance, we know that many people actually would save money with an electric vehicle over the course of a lifetime, but they don't have the initial capital to buy it. So giving people, for instance, preferential access to credit might help. And also, you might think about what kind of other administrative constraints there are. For instance, people who are renting a house might not be able to easily reinstall a heat pump or insulate the building. So you might think about what kind of legal changes you would need to give also landlords incentive changes, or to also make people give people the opportunity to have the permission to, for instance, install a wall box in a rental apartment, which might actually face some legal obstacles. So to sum up, what I think it's really most important to look at different policies that might support low-income households to adjust to higher carbon prices. And I think we really need to get real-world evidence, to get empirics, what has been done where, what has worked under which circumstances, and also use some kind of creative, let's say, trial and error procedure where we try different policies and have a very, from the beginning on, a very close monitoring procedure to learn what has worked and what needs to be taken into account to actually ensure that these policies really achieve their goals.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I think you're absolutely right. It's quite a challenge to design and in many cases implement a targeted subsidy policy for energy related products. And I think that's a key question that I think a lot of governments are grappling with. Enrico, can I request you to talk a little bit about implications of low carbon transition on labor? We all know about what type of implications there are on consumers, but can you briefly talk about what kind of implications that would have on labor? And I'll request you to maybe shorten your answer in about 5 minutes because we want to now take question and answers from the audience after that. Thank you very much, Enrico.
Thanks. I'll try to be as brief as possible. First of all, let me congratulate all the other speakers for their very insightful intervention. It was very interesting for me to listen. Just maybe as a quick reaction to what has been said before is that it's when we talk about the cost of action to address climate change, it's always important also to mention that also cost of inaction needs to be considered. So not doing nothing to address climate change or environmental pollution at the same time as also distribution implication, which in the end fall to the shoulders of the most vulnerable. So it's always important to have these two dimensions, something we try to do more and more at the IISD when we discuss these two elements together. So let me just jump directly to the labor implication of the transition. So as you know, according to the most recent analysis, we have, for instance, the one from the International Energy Agency, the low carbon transition will result overall in the creation of 30 million jobs globally by 2030. So it's quite a short time frame. And around roughly half of this job will be created in activities connected to clean energy, while the other half in sectors such as building retrofitting, manufacturing of energy efficiency appliance, electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. At the same time, on the other side, we have around 7 million jobs that are projected to be lost, and these are mostly in coal mining and the oil and gas sector. So basically, when we are talking from the transition from a labor perspective, the key challenge is to ensure that workers that lose their jobs can then transition to the new green jobs created by the low carbon policies. So in this context, it's very important to consider that the low carbon transition a very strong regional dimension, in the sense that the job losses are likely to be geographically concentrated. That's because the activities linked to extraction of fossil fuel resources, coal, oil, gas, are naturally clustered close to where the reserves is. Coal miners are all close to a coal mine, basically. And so if the new green jobs are not created in the same regions where the jobs are lost, then workers will have to leave their communities in order to find new jobs. And that creates a lot of negative implications for their family, for the community's life, and for the region, more broadly speaking. Other elements to consider when we are talking about the labor challenge of the transition is that mining industries often offer relatively high wages to relatively less skilled workers. At the same time, there's also a gender dimension, in the sense, or better, two gender dimensions. The first one is that workers of this industry are generally men. At the same time, as we grow, or as the green energy industry grows, it's very important that we ensure that women can benefit from this job as well, while the industry generally is taken, the jobs in this industry are mostly taken by men. So this is a challenge. What are the solutions? Ensuring a fair transition is a complex challenge. The good thing is that we as a society have undergone a number of experience of industrial restructuring in the past. You can think about the impacts of globalization, or when there's been a need of phasing out certain steel mills in certain regions. So basically we can look at what countries have done in the past and try to distill the best practices and try to see what are the key challenges and how we can address them. At the IISD, we have looked at a number of cases of industrial restructuring, and we can say successful experience built on four key pillars. The first one is long-term planning with the local communities. The case studies highlight that we need to have a strong process of stakeholder engagement, and this usually leads to have more politically resilient strategies and also to have more comprehensive strategies. And in this context, let me emphasize the word long-term, because past experience underlined that restructuring is a very long process. A second key policy element is having in place skill policies. Once we have a long-term vision, we must have the right skill in place to get there. And to this end, we need to have well-funded retraining and upskilling programs that are closely tied to the needs of the labor market and to the transition strategy, to the vision that the region has for itself for the future. And importantly, during this period of training, adequate income support needs to be provided to workers. In this context, let me just add that when you're thinking about the skills of the future, we need to consider the green transition is taking place in the context of broader macro trends. So digitalization, aging in certain OECD countries, all the elements we need to consider when we're thinking about what skills workers need to acquire. The third element is active labor market policies, which basically refers to instruments that connect people to jobs. And this involves, for instance, early dissemination of information on skills which are in demand, but also training on how to navigate the job market. If you've been in the same industry for 20 years, you may be a bit lost on how to search for a new job. And finally, of course, all of this requires funding. Where this funding can come from? Well, for instance, we have discussed a lot pricing carbon emission, and these raise considerable additional tax revenues for governments. For instance, it's been estimated that a carbon tax, a relatively low carbon tax around 30 euro per ton will generate revenues of around 1% of GDP for G20 countries. So this is a huge amount of money, which can be used to for different objectives according to the country we're talking about. But a part of this can also be used to finance these adjustment measures. And I think, like, for the sake of time, I will stop here.
Okay, Enrico, thank you very much. We'll now enter into a Q&A session. A number of questions have been posted on the chat box and they have been answered as well. Can I request our participants to maybe raise their hands? And if there is any specific question that you wish to ask from one of our panelists, please be specific and also state your name and the question and who do you want the question to be answered. That'd be great. Okay, one of the questions that we got in the chat box was about the impacts. Now, Michael, I think, was the name. The question was, there can be impacts which can be positive in the short run, but negative in the long run. Do you think these types of the tools and the types of policies we have, can they actually balance the short-term positive or short-term negative with the long-run positive or negative policies? Can I request Joshim to answer that question? Joshim?
Yes. Sorry, in terms of the difference between short-term and the long-term impacts of policies, of energy policies, was that the? I was just answering
right.
another.
So the question is, there can be certain implications which can be positive in the short run, but maybe negative in the long run. How do you balance policies so that you look at both short-term implications as well as long-term implications of energy policies?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think part of it comes through assessing, the different types of energy policies that governments are implementing, and then assessing the differentiated short-term and long-term impacts that these policies can have. So as been mentioned by different speakers during the call today, some measures, for example, in the response to the energy price crisis, while they may respond potentially to some short-term impacts, may be difficult to reverse in the long run. For example, implementing fossil fuel subsidies or price caps, and be particularly costly. So it comes down, I think, to an opportunity cost as well, because the money that's being used to support some of these short-term measures with potentially detrimental climate impacts, but with potentially some potential positive social impacts, may in the long run lead to less revenue that could be used for other measures with more long-term social benefits. So I think it really comes down to assessing which type of energy policy is being, or climate policy is being implemented, and better understanding the opportunity costs, and which groups stand to benefit. Because as we mentioned, untargeted VAT cuts or just price freezes are not targeted and they're not pro-poor. But then, of course, if there's a more targeting of the subsidies, and then, as Michael said, there's a number of ways to try and do that, and also implement more long-term measures in terms of increasing investments in public transportation or supporting households through incentives for installing heat pumps, and targeting even some of the measures that can have regressive impacts. I think even clean energy policies can end up with much less detrimental social impacts. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
Okay, I hope it does. Rachel has asked a question for Enrico. The question is, given the changing nature of skills and qualifications that will be needed in the new economy, are there initiatives occurring or being considered with educational sectors, for example, universities or colleges or secondary or higher education schools? What focus is on youth, our future green economy workforce? Enrico?
Let me say probably like a few things in this regard. One thing is, as I mentioned, when we are working on skills, especially for in the educational context, so for workers or people are going to enter the labor market in a number of years, it's very important to consider all the macro trends that are affecting our society. So I mentioned aging in certain OECD countries. We have rapid technological change, globalization, migration, digitalization is also a key one. So overall, all this makes particularly complex to know what will be the labor market of the future and what will be the skills of the future. So I would say that in this, say, context of uncertainty, I think there are probably two key skills that students should have. One is investing in education in STEMs, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which are key skills for the green transition, but also for the digital transition. But the second element is probably also, there should be a key skill that students should have is the ability to engage in lifelong learning. Lifelong learning, very briefly put, is the idea that education never stops and you need to keep on investing in your skills to adapt to changing circumstances. So in this regard, like something, education system should work on is to create this habit of continuous learning, and at the same time also to provide students with a tool for doing this. And the last elements is also the idea of connecting industries with education systems. And that's because industries are the ones that really know what are the key skills that are needed in a moment, in this specific moment. And we see in a number of OECD countries, there is this issue of the skill gap, in the sense of certain skills are in demand from the industry, but they're not provided by education. So it's also a key element on which the education system should work on. Thanks. I hope this answered the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question that we saw on the chat box, and maybe I can request Celine to answer this. In terms of the methodology that you've developed, is it possible to understand the barriers for acceptability of climate measures? Is there any way through which we can analyze what are the barriers for acceptability of climate measures? Celine?
Yeah, I think that maybe one point that I could come back on is how, so I mentioned that the methodology is divided into 2 stages. And so the first one, the framework can be applied to any green budget assessment. And it is rather using the framework, you can directly apply it to any budget. And the second stage, which was about selecting 10 to 15 hotspots and analyzing these hotspots in more detail. The difference here is that, the next part, so regarding the analysis of these hotspots, is more of a self-guided assessment rather than a methodology that will give you results explicitly. And so, of course, this will depend on different national contexts, and you will have to take into consideration, different contexts and policies. So it is more of a self-guided assessment, and there are no clear indicators of whether a measure could reach public acceptability or not, what could be the barriers. It is really specific to different measures and countries. But so what we've done is to apply this framework to the French budget, so taking into account the national context. And this can only be done country per country.
Okay, thank you very much, Celine. I'll put up a last question. Now, this was also put up on the chat box, and maybe I can request Joachim to reply. Does this poverty tracker also look at gender, Joachim?
No, I mean, so it's a good question. So we don't, as I said, we look at more income inequality. So really the difference between higher income groups and lower income groups, and also monetary and multidimensional poverty. When we looked at multidimensional poverty, we looked at how certain types of energy policies might increase emissions, which could be particularly detrimental, say for at the local level for certain indigenous groups or even certain income groups. But we didn't look specifically at gender inequality. So that's indeed an important aspect, but I think it would be addressed through future research.
Okay, thank you very much. Joachim, do you want to make any closing remarks? Because I think we're now close to the closing time. And if there is any maybe last word that you want to say before we close.
Thanks to everyone, to all the panelists, and for everyone who joined. I think it was a really diverse and session, and we got some very interesting perspectives from people from different backgrounds and who've worked on this topic for a while. So I personally thought it was very insightful. So thanks for everyone for joining.
Okay, thank you very much. And the presentations are going to be shared. All the presentations that have been made will be shared together with links to some of the resources that we've talked about today as well. I have shared some resources online, but we're going to be sharing further resources for you to look at the policy tracker, the French budget methodology, and all the other tools that we have talked today. So everyone, thank you very much for your time, and we hope to see you on another important topic in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.